So hey everyone, this is George Strezov again with the new episode of For Music, the soundtrack podcast. And in this episode, today's episode, I'll be talking to my good friend Ed White, who's joining us here from London. And just a few words before I leave the talking to him. Ed and I go way back, and we've done some amazing projects together. We've been nerding out about soundtracks and composers and film music for, I would say, more than 10 years, maybe 2010, 2011. So yeah, Ed, welcome to the show, and I'm so glad that you could join us.
Oh, George, I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with you. It's, as you say, I think we've got a lot of history together, and so there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we actually met virtually on the Sounds Online forums.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's funny actually when I think about all of the notable people on that forum. You know, think about Alex Pfeffer, and you know there were loads of people who were just on that forum and making their opinions known and helping people, and sort of those names then became three-dimensional once people started using video to vlog and all the rest of it. And
right.
Yeah, it was a great and very fertile sort of area where people who were trying to do mock-ups and orchestral work without orchestras, you know, and it was the early days really of kind of commercial sampling. I think East West really were the ones who cracked that open, and it was pre-Spitfire as well. They were, you know,
I think Spitfire. At that time they had the custom shop that was you had to apply to get the library. So, but it was I think around the era where forums were on their peak. Afterwards, now it's not that much. It's all on Facebook and Instagram. But it was so nice to be able to exchange, ideas. And in this particular case, you actually just made a new version of your website and posted it out. So I went in and listened to some demos that were recorded in Bulgaria. So I was like, oh, that's amazing. Have you been to Bulgaria? And then you replied, well, I'm actually coming there next week. Do you want to meet?
Yes.
And that's how a friendship happened.
Yeah, well, it's funny as well. My version of this story is also, it's a little bit more kind of, there's more detail to it, which is that I remember being in the session, and it was quite a big session. I think we had something like 80 players, and you know, it was a very, very dense score, and I had big aspirations with the writing, so I'd put in a detail. And I remember there was this particular moment where there was like a bum note coming from the brass, and it was in the score, and it was obviously something where I just accidentally nudged a note in Sibelius into the wrong place in the brass. And I was kind of like pouring through this score, kind of thinking, oh gosh, of all the money that's just getting wasted whilst the players are sitting there and we're trying to figure it out. And then this super calm, collected, but very young at that time, George Strezov leans in over my shoulder and just points on the conductor score. It's there. And I was like, this guy's amazing. We're going to be friends. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And afterwards we worked on a bunch of stuff together. One of them was the film Listening.
Yes.
You were really kind to actually invite me in Sphere Studios to conduct the music, which was an amazing experience. Sadly, Sphere no longer exists in London.
That's right. So yeah, I think the thing about that room as well, actually, the real tragedy, but I think it's been turned into a block of flats. You know, they literally knocked it down and demolished it and started again, and you know, so there's now a block of luxury flats there. But the thing that was a real shame was it was just a magical acoustic space. And Francesco Camelli, who had built the studio and owned the studio, it was an amazing space for percussion, but it was also quite a magical space. Even though it wasn't that big, it was a magical space for strings. It really imparted a kind of three-dimensionality to the sound. So yeah, it's really sad that it's gone. But you know, Frank picked the studio up and moved it to Los Angeles. So
And it's a pretty big room.
In LA, yes,
LA.
yeah. So that was formerly a room that was owned by Linda Perry,
Hmm.
and Frank bought it from her. And of course, Frank being Frank, stuffed it full of, the best of the best mic selection and the desks. He had this custom SSL desk with a red leather finish. So yeah, that was amazing.
Amazing. All right, so let's get on the topic of music and soundtracks. I know, personally, I know that you have a very a bunch of very important thoughts about music in general, and one of them being the music storytelling capabilities.
Yes.
And since not everyone who's listening will know about your thoughts about this, can you just elaborate a bit more about it?
Yeah, so I think, here's the thing, musical storytelling, you find it in program music, you find it in opera, you find it even in symphonic music. There is often some kind of storytelling, even if it's not explicitly laid out. And so music has this incredibly powerful facility to tell stories. Music takes place over time as well, so there are kind of structural considerations which impact story. And so once you kind of couple it very naturally with film, those early film composers were drawing very heavily from the concert hall and the traditions of musical dramaturgy that had pre-existed film. And so, music has this incredible capacity for storytelling that marries very, very well to film. And you often find, I think, that, our very best film composers are often our very best, or certainly this used to be the case, that our very best film composers were also our very best composers at the time,
Yep. And how does this, do you think, translate when it comes to film music? Because we know, and now you talk about operas and symphonic music, but do directors know about the strength of music in general when it comes to developing a storyline?
I think prior to computers, there was this sort of sense of it being a dark art, that directors really had to rely upon their composer 100%. They might hear some piano demos, but then really the first time they heard it was when everyone showed up in one room at one time and one place to record to tape the score. And so they were reliant on the composer's expertise. So they were hiring really composers who were at the top of the tree in terms of capability. And I think what happens when you get the computer involved, and I love computers, and I'm not a purist in the sense that I would say that computers have ruined things, but I do think they have thrown some challenges in, which is that when you look at a DAW, it looks functionally not that different to a nonlinear editor. So, for example, Avid or one of those. So it means that a director gets this false sense of security around how music and film work together. So I think that what has happened is that because you can cut something together very quickly, you can chuck a temp track underneath it, you can get a sense of whether it's working at a basic level. It might have given directors a false sense of competence with their musical storytelling, because they are often conforming their picture to a pre-existing piece of music, which is then going to get taken away, which we call temp track and temp love. And whereas in olden days, people were essentially cutting together their optical film, and the composer had a moviola, and they would take their timings in the morning with their music editor, and then they would spend the afternoon having put the timings onto manuscript paper, probably not to picture, thinking very, very carefully about how they were going to conform the music emotionally to the story. So
Sure.
I think the process is very different now than how it was in the golden era of film music.
I like what you said about directors and the software, because it really does make them gets them in their comfort zone, so to say.
Yeah.
So and I found that actually directors love this process of, at least here in my experience, to come to the studio to watch the picture and and the music. Do you work that way personally?
I think one of the most stressful experiences I've had in my career was having a director who wanted to sit with me whilst I wrote every single note of the score. And every day he would come in and he would sit behind me, and you go through as a composer 1,000 mistakes before you find the thing that you are happy with and that you would present to the world. And so that was a very stressful experience, because every time I would know that what I was doing was wrong, even before he would know. But, I'd then hear this voice from the back of the room, no, not that. And I know not that, but I have to, it's a process of iteration. And whereas I've also had experiences, particularly with video games, where, I find that if you and ideally it's not two people, ideally there's more than two people, I think. If you can have like the editor, the director, and the composer in a room, and you all stand up, I think that's very important as well. You don't do the meeting sitting down. I think it completely changes the psychology. So you all stand up and it becomes more like a band. And you can have this. I've been in bands where people would say, no, that idea isn't very good, you should rethink it. But because it has this sort of feeling of real-time collaboration, it can be very, very productive. If you can have the psychology that, the editor is the drummer and the director is, the lead singer.
The lead singer, yeah.
and maybe the composer is just trying to get their guitar solo in somewhere,
That's right.
And, that can work very, very well. I think the longer that I've been doing this a while now, and I've had the experience where they lock the film and it was shot on film and you get 12 weeks to write the score, and that's wonderful. That never happens anymore. The film is always fluid right up until the end. But also you find that there are a lot of voices that have an opinion about what the score should be doing. So I think as detestable as it can sometimes be, it's very important for composers to, if you could think it's a band, I'm in a band. This is, it's a collaboration between everybody. That's when you get the best results, I think, now.
I was playing in a band once, and one of the things that annoyed me the most was the guitar player. We're good friends, but every time I was like, man, you're just so loud. Just turn down the volume just a bit, because obviously we didn't have an engineer or somebody to, and he was like, oh, sure. And then he would probably decrease from the guitar, the volume a bit, and then increase from the amp, or the other way around. So either way, it's
you still ended up with the same amount of volume. Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty good, analogy for a composer, which is that the composer's writing the music and is, desperately trying to make sure that their bit is heard, and it's probably a bit like the guitar. I'm a guitarist as well, so I'm doubly cursed.
And I know that when we worked on listening,
yes,
there was something really cool that we did here in Bulgaria, which was we had this aleatoric type of a choral texture. Yes. And I remember that you wanted to record this in the four corners of the room, so that afterwards you can mix it in surround. So this is a really cool idea, which is also connected to the storyline of the project. It's not just an idea that occurred to you; it's actually connected to what's going on the screen. Yeah. So, do you think it's important for, especially nowadays with all the samples and synthesizers, to strive for a custom sound for the project that you're working on?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, he gets a lot of flack, but I think that's the thing where you could say that Hans Zimmer really did kind of carve out a important aspect of film music that I'm not sure existed really prior to that. Prior to Hans, it was very much people were getting an orchestra in a room and they would play with the ensemble size and makeup and all the rest of it and the instrumentation. But ultimately, it was, the level of what is the ensemble. Whereas I think that Hans really started to think about the production and how you would make it feel like, I've heard him use this phrase where he talks about making it feel like the music is coming out of the very pores of the scenery, and that your production aesthetic is as important as your leitmotifs, your themes, and it is as important as your instrumentation. Thinking about how are you going to produce this to make it feel as conformed to picture and story as possible. I think it's a new aspect of film scoring, and I say new as in within the last 20 years or so, that it's very, very important to think about your production.
Yeah, well, there were some cases like this in the past. Maybe Chinatown from Jerry Goldsmith, which was he had a very unique and specific sound. But yeah, generally when you look for example, the 80s or the late 70s, you would get like Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Back to the Future. So they're kind of the same, different music, different composers, the stylistic approach, but still the same ensemble side, the same sound.
Absolutely. And Goldsmith was definitely an early adherent to, taking synthesizers and playing with them with the orchestra. Yeah. I think, format, a lot of technology and format drives some of this stuff. So, you didn't always have surround, so initially it was, mono, and then it was stereo, and then you started, the technology started to break into these areas of, well, what does surround sound like? And with that, you start to kind of find composers playing with the format. And so I think Hans was probably one of the first people to really think about that, the format. And how you could play with the format to really immerse audiences. And, I think they're still doing that. Those guys there, to take the Dolby Atmos stuff and think about Dune, or Stephen Price's score for Gravity. Oh, yeah. I saw that in a Dolby Atmos theater in Los Angeles when it came out, and it was incredible because you had this sort of really sculpted, some synth sound is kind of passing above your head while another one's moving behind you, and it's really, really immersive. So. But these are technology, they're driven by technology, a lot of these things. So until the technology exists, composers are limited. So yes, it's important, but it's very much kind of rooted in the technology.
Well, but it's also limited, but also unlimited in a way. Because now you have so much more stuff that you can do, opposed to, for example, what John Williams could have done in the 70s or in the 80s. Again, it's as we say here in Bulgaria, like a two-bladed knife. So
double-edged sword.
Double-edged sword. Okay. And another thing that kind of is connected to my previous question about the sound was again something that you told me. I think it was the first time that we met, and I really remember this very close to my heart. So it's you said that obviously I ask you the obvious question, which is how to get work, and
Yes.
then you said that the best way to do it is to meet like aspiring filmmakers, like actors and directors, screenwriters, even just get into that like scene and pool of people and a pool of talent, and actually talk to them about their movie, about their project.
Yeah.
Is it the same now that you're also working with video games?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny actually, because for years people were saying to me, you should do video games. Your music would really lend itself to video games. And I was like, well, if you know anybody, I'm happy to do that. And then it was interesting actually, because a really good friend of mine who I had played in bands with for years, actually, for various different personal reasons, he'd decided to refocus and had become an art lead at a video game developer. Mm-hmm. And he also had a side project that he was doing, and he didn't have any music in his side project, and it was kind of a cold experience, should we say, playing the game, because there wasn't any music. So I just said, well, I'm just going to write a bunch of music speculatively for my friend's game.
Sure.
There was no money, nothing. And at that point, I was in a career space where I could speculate the time. So I just wrote a bunch of music and I gave it to him, and he put it in the game, and he said, wow, this is amazing. It works really well. And the game is so much better for the music. And of course, then in his day job, when he was working at this other developer, which happened to be, they were doing the next Gears of War game, he said, you have to talk to my friend because, he's got the right voice for this game. And that didn't get me the gig, but it got me into the room. And getting into the room is I think the hardest thing. I literally posted on Facebook the other day about, there's a wonderful Sylvester Stallone quote: "If the door is locked, try the window." And if you can get yourself into the room, you can get someone to listen to your music, and if you can get someone to listen to your music, and you've really thought about the music that you're going to put in front of them, you've really curated it to make sure it's a good fit for their project and what they're going to do, then that's a very good chance that you can get that gig. And that's what happened with me. That I got into the room, and I was able to get my music in front of them, and they realized that I really understood Gears of War, and that I did understand what a Gears of War game should sound like from a music perspective. But again, it was all about having a friend who was already making video games, and whatever you're trying to do, you might have, it might be, maybe you want to get into TV commercials. It's like, well, find someone who, find a way of genuinely, and that's the other thing I think people get really wrong about networking. You have to be interested in people and love people.
Of course. Yeah.
Because you can't do it. You can't do it from a position of, what can this person do for me? You have to find the people who can do things for you. Then you have to forget that they can do things for you, and literally be interested in them as human beings. So you would find an ad creative, or you would find a TV ad producer, and probably not TV ad directors, because they don't have a huge amount of say in the music, from my experience. And befriend those people, and don't ask them. At some point, it will come up naturally.
Yeah,
you can let them drive it, and inevitably, at some point, you'll get a crack at something, and then it's yours to lose at that point.
Sure. Yeah, and also maybe argue with them as well.
Yeah, I think if that's the thing about, if you're interested in people and you have a real relationship with people, then you can disagree with them in a healthy way. They might say, well, I think it's, I often encounter this saying where people say, well, you shouldn't hear the music. And I said, no, 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 no. I don't agree with that. There are moments where you shouldn't hear the music and it should be very subtle. But there are moments where you absolutely should hear the music. So half of, musical storytelling, I think, is deciding where are we going to hear the music and where do we need music, but we're not going to notice it so much.
Yeah, this is maybe one of the hardest things, especially for me, because in my writing I like to overwrite things, because I'm always thinking that people would say, "Oh, he just did a lazy job" or something like this. So I always try to, and sometimes that's not good for a film, and I often got into arguments with filmmakers that, for example, they would say, you know what, Hans Zimmer or Trent Reznor, fantastic, composer, fantastic music, that's perfect for the film. And I was like, no, that's not perfect for the film. What you need for the film is the film sound. You don't need... Yes. It doesn't have to be everything, nowadays tends to be like whatever's the trendiest at the moment.
Yes.
And that's what I meant with argue with people. So try to
well, it's
present,
educate them.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, and educate them, and also let them educate you in a sense that there will be something about those score references that they have that, because they know their film. Or their video game or whatever it is. They've spent a long time thinking about it. And pre-existing music is often the only way that they can articulate some of the qualities that they're hoping for in their own score. So I think we always have to be sort of careful not to dismiss these things. I mean, I went through a period of time where everyone was saying to me, we want it to sound, you'd have these big conversations about characters and dramatic themes and, and I would sort of be taking that stuff and writing and struggling to get a cue signed off. And it would always devolve to, look, can we just make it sound like The Dark Knight? We just want it to sound like The Dark Knight. And I think the piece of communication there is actually, we want to do sort of things which are propulsive and kinetic and, have tickers and, all of these things and big exclamation marks, should we say, in the music, but not necessarily a very complicated sentence that precedes, and yeah, I mean, so it's important to also try and let them educate you because they know their film.
Yeah. Well, when I was scoring Surviving Mars, there was based on the budget that I had, I decided to do, synths, lots of synths.
Yeah.
And then like an orchestra on top. But I throughout the entire process, I was like, I want the orchestra to be a chamber orchestra, so very intimate. So opposed to the huge sound of the synths. So this parallel between the robots and the people that are living in a dome on Mars. So anyway, but I used the samples I used were Berlin strings and I don't know, Spitfire, so stuff that's over the top. You would get 16 first violins or 18 first violins, and then I would get the demo approved, and then I would go to record. And after the recording, they would say, it sounds really nice, but it sounds different than the demo. It sounds kind of low budget. We cannot point it out. It sounds, thin. And then I had to, that's a mistake that I did, but then I had to actually educate them about the stylistic approach that I took, which is, again, unique for the game. Going to a bit to the documentary scene where you have quite a bunch of shows that you wrote the music for, like for example Mankind, The Story of All of Us. I and also Bear Grylls Mission Survive. So I've noticed something about your process, which you can let me know if I'm wrong or not. And that's you would opposed to writing for for the show itself, you would always have some, like, I don't know, soldiers waiting, like a custom library of yours.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting as well, because I think that this approach is now how big budget, AAA Hollywood films are also scored, because of the nature of the cut being so fluid and VFX coming in late and all of that sort of thing. So I think that the approach is now perhaps because of, and again, it's to do with non-linear editing and all the rest of it. It's driven by technology and time frames and time schedules and the fact that nothing is ever locked. But that was certainly very true when it was Tom Howe, Anne Nickerton and myself did Mankind. And, there was a lot of, I don't know how those guys did it, but to me, it seemed just based on the schedule that the way to work was to find an approach that you knew was going to work against picture in pretty much any circumstance.
Sure.
Then write your socks off to produce as many tracks as you could, stem those tracks, and then you could always just kind of music edit against picture. And if you needed to gap fill, because you had a moment where, it was going to be funny if you tried to edit it or something.
Sure. So
you would effectively music edit your own music to picture and then fill the gaps. And that seems to be, I think that's how a lot of these kind of big AAA movies that are getting produced. People are having teams of people write them, a library's worth of music. And then the music editors work with the editorial team to place those tracks. And then it's about gap filling. So again, it's not so much composers responding to picture anymore, but doing whatever they can to get a certain production value over the line in the time frame. And that was, I think, very much born out of, the factual entertainment genre, where if you tried to chase the cut, you go crazy.
Yeah, especially on a show like for example, Bear Grylls Mission Survive, which is reality TV. So they don't have. Yeah. So if you have a client that wants like a reality TV, like show with a unique sound, uniquely composed sound, then you're basically screwed. So because you need to,
Yeah. The other thing as well, I think it's important to bear in mind in that genre that the edit producers, and there are maybe 10 edit suites cutting sequences of stuff or cutting episodes. Those edit suites are then having a series producer who's presenting the work upwards to the channel, and then the channel has an opinion on it, and they come back and they say, this isn't feeling right to me. And one of the quickest things that the edit producer can do to make something feel different is change the music on it. And they'll reconform their picture. Again, this is what I was saying about it's the music is not following the picture anymore. The picture's following music now. So it's a very different landscape. And that's why editors have so much power as well now, I think, because they're really the architects of how the thing holds together. And there's not a huge amount of room for composers to respond emotionally to picture anymore. But, the quickest thing they can do is change the music and reconform the picture a little bit. Suddenly it's different, and maybe they'll get that cut signed off this time.
Sure. And how do you normally handle this, how to say this, legally? I mean, do you write library music especially for the show, or do you have like a generic Edward White library that you can license the music?
I mean, it depends, So, for example, I think you wrote a couple of cues that ended up in the international versions of Bear Grylls Mission Survive, and so in that sense, I think there was an aspiration at one point to start a library that would be like a traditional library. And then, that was sort of superseded by the fact that it was very difficult. I don't consider myself to be a music library. I'm a composer, and I think I perhaps had underestimated that, there are lots of libraries out there, and it was a point in time when everyone was starting a library music company because it was almost like an oil rush.
Yes.
It's like, oh, library music, because no one's hiring composers anymore, and there's Audio Network, and there's a couple of others, but and also I think the quality of library music didn't used to be perhaps as good as it now is. I think library music now is and so editors and directors and production sort of fell in love with library music and that model and the power that it gave them with their cut. I think if you can, come up with a library for a project, if you can come up with it in advance of them hitting post-production. So they would get in touch with you right at the beginning of the project, and they would say, "We're sending off Bear Grylls into the jungle today. He's going to do this series. Would you write the music for it?" And you get some top line information about what the tone of the series is, and it's like, start writing that library on that day, because 3 months later, when they arrive at your doorstep, going, "Okay, we need episode 1 in 3 days' time." You want to have done your homework in advance. So it's a combination of two things. I think if you can have what I call orphaned tracks as well, always take your orphaned tracks and tuck them into a drawer. So, I know that there's a guitarist called Steve Vai, and he has, it used to be a physical drawer, but now I think it's back when it was tapes. But now he has a drive that he calls his Infinity drawer. And it's all the ideas that never found a home. Sure. Put it in there, and then you can kind of pull them out. And I think it's great to be able to kind of pull something out of that drawer, try it up against picture, and 9 times out of 10, you'll find that you've already done the heavy lifting somewhere.
But that's also the problem with custom sound for the project, because I've been into situations where I would need to basically rewrite the entire film or game soundtrack, and if it's too unique, then maybe those orphan tracks cannot find another home unless I rearrange them in a very heavily manner. If it's very too complicated and different.
I mean, it's interesting. I had a guy that I worked with called Stuart Cameron, who was a producer of a couple of films that I did, but he also kind of cut his teeth in advertising. And he had this view, and I think it was wonderful. I really learned a lot, actually, because he had this point of view that he said, if you have an incongruous instrument, and what he meant by that was something that is a really curated sound that wouldn't naturally, you think, okay, it's an orchestra. Okay, well, what's our incongruous instrument going to be? Well, maybe it's an electric guitar, or maybe it's a synth line, or maybe it's a vocal that's been processed in a particular way, where you really take a deep dive on the production of that sound. And then your incongruous instrument becomes a way of really making your score feel tailored to that particular story. And I think you can take any library music track that you've written, or any orphaned track, and as long as you've still got the session for it, you can, if you have your incongruous instrument that you've designed or thought about for the main body of your score, you music edit the thing together, and then you put your incongruous instrument over the top of it, and suddenly now that orphaned track that didn't belong does belong. I always remember I was working on a film, and, Tom Howe came into my room to visit me, and I said, I'm really struggling to make this scene match, some of the other stuff. And he said, well, just take some of the guitars and some of that percussion and just stick it under this one. And it's incredibly simple. And you suddenly realize, oh, actually, you can make sense of very different musical approaches just by giving them something that binds them together and is common.
I also think that I'm gonna name names. So, for example, I'm looking at the IMDb page of Bear McCreary, who's an amazing composer. I love his stuff, and especially the stuff that he did for Outlander and for God of War, and also Black Sails and Da Vinci's Demons. I think Da Vinci's Demons is a very clever soundtrack, and he always tries to do some unique stuff for each of his projects, which I think is one of his main strengths. Yeah. And on the other hand, his writing approach is more like old school, opposed to, for example, Hans Zimmer. Yeah. But I don't see any physical way of him doing like 6 TV shows and a movie per year unless he's doing something like this, composing some themes, stemming them out, and then maybe creating a library and sub tracks comprised of previously edited, stems. So maybe it's necessary, because I've done a TV series, like primetime TV series, and it was about 40 minutes of music a week that we needed to write. So I had like 3 other people that helped me by writing to picture, because that's a really difficult process, and I don't imagine, somebody doing 4 or 5 of these at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the team, it's really interesting, actually, because I think there's now this narrative that you can't do this job without a team, and that the only way to get to do this job is by being a part of someone's team, and then maybe they bring you up. And, I was just in Los Angeles, and it was said to me by someone who shall remain nameless, and they said, Los Angeles is sort of littered with the carcasses of, composer assistants people who came in and they thought they were going to get their leg up and become the next person, the next sort of darling of the film music community. And they just got completely burned out being an assistant. So there is this narrative that, like, if you're a composer, you can't do the job without assistants. And that if you want to get into the industry, you have to be an assistant. And I don't actually agree with that, because I didn't really use assistants, and I still, I have people that I can go to if I get myself into a bind. But in the main, I do the job entirely myself. And I think it's entirely possible to do that. Where I've found myself getting into a bind, it's normally because things overlap. And I think once you become as successful as someone like Bear McCreary, or Hans Zimmer or Lorne Balfe or any of those kind of, A-list guys, and there are some A-list girls out there as well now, which is great. That what you find is it is not possible to do multiple projects that overlap without a team.
And they will always overlap. They will inevitably overlap.
And they will always be overlapping. And so the question is to what degree are you able to spin multiple plates and manage other people who are also managing to spin multiple plates. And so it can become very devolved. And I think that, quality can become an issue, because I've listened to quite a lot of recent soundtracks that have real standout, beautiful writing. The cues are proper, AAA stuff. And then it's like you're going through and then you sort of hit this cue in the middle of the soundtrack and you're like, everything about this cue is not as good as the others. Yeah. So is that just that the composer ran out of time, or was it that they didn't have their eye on whomever was responsible for that cue? And maybe whomever was responsible for that cue was relatively new and green and maybe didn't have all of the skill set that they needed. I think because there's so much content and I hate that word content, but there are so many things that are getting produced now. All of these companies have their streaming models, and, you still have a couple of big, tentpole movies getting produced every year. And there's so much television stuff, that, there's sort of so much music, that's needed, for these things there's now people coming into the industry who find themselves writing perhaps on a gig that they're not even ready for. And so they then are having to get a team around them just to be able to get the gig over the line. And it becomes very bitty. And so some cues are good and some cues are not good. So, I think you can absolutely do the job 100% on your own if you're prepared to do one job at a time, which for a long period of time I was happy to do. But, in 2022, I've gotten a bit greedy. So I didn't want to say no to anything. So now I've had to start working with other composers. And it's very interesting as well. Last Sunday when I was in LA, I was having, spending the afternoon with, and I'll leave them nameless, but a very, 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 very well-known Hollywood film composer at their house. And part of what we talked about was, how do you get the best out of assistants, and how do you make it work across multiple projects? How do you spin multiple plates and maintain the quality? So I think it's those questions are apparent all the way up and down the tree of film composing and TV composing and video game composing. Everyone's trying to figure out, how do I work with my team better? Which is
essentially maybe a problem that I would even think that I don't know, Michelangelo had, because they didn't work alone.
Yeah.
They probably had a factory full of people helping them out, and film scoring, not only film scoring, like composing has always been assumed to be this very, very solitary, profession of a person that's all-knowing, person that knows about all the instruments and about and especially nowadays you need to it's assumed that you also know how to mix and master your stuff. And
well, it's funny. It's funny. I think, if you think about Leonard Bernstein or someone like that, who was an incredibly competent composer, orchestrator, conductor, he could do all of the jobs at an incredibly high level, but never had to encounter dealing with a DAW, never had to think about samples or anything like that. And I've heard it said by John Williams, he's like, I'm a pencil and a paper guy, and maybe I should have learned these other things, but I just didn't have the time to. And so now it's like, and it's interesting as well, because, I always remember Cicchino was talking about the fact that actually you can scribble something on a piece of manuscript paper and you can give it to, he was talking about the lost scores, and how you can scribble something on paper and leave it to the player to interpret. And that's super economical time-wise. You write the note and sur le pont over the top of it, and they're going to do trem sur le pont, and it's going to start, and it's a little wedge that's going to open up, and the note's going to get louder over time, and by the end of it, you can write really frenzied, over the top of your manuscript paper and leave it to the player to interpret, and then that's very quick. You do that very economically, time-wise. You try and mock that up, and suddenly it's no longer economical time-wise. Yeah. So the old ways still trump the new ways in a lot of respects, if you have competence there and if you have the trust of collaborators who are happy to just walk into the studio and hear it for the first time when you're recording it. If you don't have that confidence from collaborators, you have to mock everything up, and then it becomes, you've got to, and then you need a team.
Yeah, that's right. Or at least, if you want to write just write the music, then find a person who do the mock-ups for you.
Yeah.
And that would be, we actually had a case here at the studio recording, like a score that had, I would say about 64 bars of music, just one chord, not changing, just one chord slurred, and then there was written at the top like something like "Go Crazy" within those notes, between sul tasto, sul pont, maybe add some artificial harmonics and stuff. So all the musicians, actually created the music, and obviously we know that this probably took about 5 minutes to write or something, but then the texture that came out of each performance was absolutely different, and was actually interesting. It became kind of like Arvo Pärt, type of piece with just one chord.
Yeah, well, even with the best will in the world, I mean, I there's this luthier in Valencia in California called Jonathan Wilson, and he makes these amazing instruments called guitar viols. And, Ramin Djawadi uses one, and Tyler Bates uses one. And they're 6 strings, and they're tuned like a guitar, but it's like a medieval arpeggione, the way that you would bow it. So it's not bowed like a cello, it's not bowed like a violin. It has very different kind of thing. And for me, that was my first experience really of understanding bowing when I got a guitar viol. And you realize even with the best will in the world, trying to play continuously one note, there's going to be timbral sort of variation in how that note comes across. And so there's the challenge with samples, I think, is always that it's a snapshot of a note in time that then often is looped, and it's very, very static. Whereas real players, you can give them 65, bars of one note, and even if they try to play those 65 measures exactly the same, consistent, it's going to be massively, it's going to vary.
Yes,
and that sort of chaos is interesting, and I think our ears like that. And it's something can be incredibly simple and yet can also be incredibly interesting at the same time.
So what do you think, now that we talk about live recordings, what do you think are the biggest challenges?
I think the biggest challenges are sort of baked in at the conceptual level. And so what I mean by that is, if you go to film music concerts, you tend to find that, with the exception of, maybe a couple of John Powell scores, How to Train Your Dragon, I've heard live, played multiple times at film music concerts. There aren't a lot of modern scores that are being successfully performed in live in concerts. So there was this point where everything was written coherently in a manner that you could perform it. You could get the players into the room, and you could have the score performed by an orchestra. And I think now, when we talked about double-edged swords and the production side of things, yes, it's great, and Hans and that kind of philosophy of film scores, where it's all about production, has meant that people are constantly experimenting and trying different things at a production level that may not be robust in terms of performance, which can then create problems with recording. So, if you think about the striped orchestra, I'm going to record my strings on one day, and I'm going to record my brass on another day. And it's actually it's quite hard, I think, for the brass to intonate without everyone else in the room with them. So then, what are you going to do? You're going to melodyne your brass afterwards. There are people who do that. So you start to kind of create problems where historically the orchestra, 400 years of orchestral music, the orchestra is sort of a marvelous self-balancing entity that has figured out all of these problems in terms of how many strings you're going to have and how many brass you need to balance, or rather how many strings you need to balance your brass and all of those things. And now people are doing multiple overdubs of stuff, or leaving stuff out to then track it separately to then, build it in the mix. I've seen and experienced myself, this thing where, you end up having to go back to the samples because you tried something that was not conceptually strong enough to survive the recording, because you're dealing with people ultimately, and I think the more experimental we get with our kind of recording and our striping of the orchestra, and I'm going to track this separately and what have you, the more rope we give to hang ourselves with, basically.
Okay, and now since our time is almost up, time for 3 Blitz questions.
Okay.
All right, so the first one is your 3 favorite and most impressive soundtracks, either for films or games.
As in that I've written, or that other people have written?
That other people have written.
I think that the last 17 minutes of E.T. is unassailable. I think it's as good as the Firebird, End of Firebird, Stravinsky, and yet it's not the same as. It's it's its own unique piece of music. It's not like he's copying the temp, but it's definitely channeling that. So yeah, the last act, I guess, of E.T. I think Gladiator was a landmark score for me. It was the first time anyone had heard the duduk, which then just became sort of this overplayed thing, and the Lisa Gerrard vocals, and so I think that was a landmark score. And I also think Inception, actually. Wow, I've put 2 Hans Zimmer scores in there
on the list. Yeah.
I think that Inception was a really important score because it dominated, or maybe interchangeable with The Dark Knight. Because honestly, for 10 years, like, filmmakers were just temping with those 2 scores.
Time from Inception. That's I've seen it hundreds of times on projects that I was about.
I'm going to be cheeky and chuck in a 4th one. I think John Powell's Bourne score as well.
Oh yeah,
has now become like the template. Like, when John did it, it was brand new. Nobody had done that. But now you hear everywhere. It's like this kind of string ostinati double note figure. It's a thing, so massively influential.
Yeah. Well, in case John Powell is listening to this podcast, I just want to let John know that I'm going to maybe inscribe the score on my underwear. That's how much I love. Yeah, especially To the Roof. To the Roof is one of my favorite pieces of the trilogy.
Yeah. Also, that bassoon figure. Da, 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 da.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Oh, that's actually. I don't, because I was on the concert in Hamburg, and they played some bits from Bourne, but I don't remember them doing the lyrical stuff, strings and bassoon. And I think that for bassoon players, this should be like top concert piece, because it's very hard to play. It's very emotional. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's like the opening of Rite of Spring,
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of in the same range, but it's very soloistic. So if there are any bassoon players listening to this podcast together with John Powell, maybe you should check out the
play the lyrical stuff from Bourne more. It's fantastic.
All right. So the next question is, what would your dream project be?
When I was starting out, all I wanted to do was like Jerry Bruckheimer action movies. That was, really well. And I still, part of me has this sort of bucket list. I'd love to do a Jerry Bruckheimer, kind of thing. But actually, I think any project that gives me the physical space to actually write a good tune, because everything is cut so tightly now that it's really hard to even find spaces for the music to breathe. And so, dream project is where the editor goes, we're going to do a 2-minute musical montage.
Yeah. All right. And what would be as a final question, what would be your advice for a younger version of yourself?
Oh, wow. When you're young, you have no responsibilities, and the consequences of failing are kind of non-existent, really. You can always pick yourself back up and go and get a job, like a proper job. So I would say, you know, seize those moments, take risks, and take risks, because I think, you know, and as I look back, it took me a long time to really kind of believe, oh, I can do this as a job. And actually, I think I probably missed out sort of on you know, opportunities because I wasn't prepared to take risks. So take risks.
Wonderful. Cool. Ed White, very good friend of mine. Thank you so much for being on this episode.
Oh, mate, pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Anytime.
And hopefully next time, now that the world is starting to get back to normal, I guess, maybe not that much, maybe in here around our area. But still, I would love to meet you again and have this same conversation over beer, which would be
oh yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, it's I think my plan for 2022 is at some point to come to Bulgaria and to record some music that I've been working on away from picture. So yeah, I hope to see you very soon.
Nice. This will be the next episode.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.